When Dead Space 3 was released in February of 2013, it sparked a staggering amount of controversy in the gaming community. While it was praised by some press outlets, most of that acclaim was quickly buried underneath a massive pile of criticism towards the title and its implementation of microtransactions. This backlash happened to such an extent that even I, a fan of both previous entries in the franchise, never truly considered picking the game up in the first place. I just didn't feel like supporting the dumbing down of a franchise that I had grown to love. I still regard Dead Space as one of the finest survival horror games that I've ever played. Even the streamlined Dead Space 2 I enjoyed immensely. So why now ruin this largely positive perception by playing something that has kind of come to be known as the Resident Evil 6 of the franchise? And so I avoided Dead Space 3 up until only a few weeks ago, where it was then included as part of this whole games collection that is offered for free for all PlayStation Plus subscribers. I downloaded it right away. Admittedly, I was pretty excited to finally play it and kind of see for myself whether I'd agree with all the criticism or not. So that's what I did, and yeah, here it is, my opinion on Dead Space 3 and what I like to think of as kind of an in-depth analysis and critique. In this video, I will talk about the single player exclusively, as I haven't had a chance to try any of the co-op yet. You may want to check other reviews for information on that part of the game, but from what I hear, it's pretty good. Additionally, this video contains all kinds of spoilers on the game, and if you still want to experience it on your own, I would very much advise against watching this right now. Video games, and I guess also movies for that matter, are best experienced when you know as little as possible about them and their plot. So yeah, you're more than welcome to check back later and compare your thoughts with mine though. With all of that out of the way, let us start where it always starts, start. The introductory chapter takes place roughly 200 years before the events of the rest of the game. You play as some researcher on some mysterious ice planet, you run around, stomp boxes, go through some tutorialized shooting sections, and right as you're thinking, alright, yeah, I think I'm getting the hang of this, the following happens. With a lot of questions left unanswered, we now move over to someone we're a little bit more familiar with, Isaac Clarke, who makes the return as the protagonist. After being introduced as a mute engineer in the first game and then transitioning over to somewhat of a talkative psycho in the second, Isaac wastes no time letting us know that he has once again undergone a transformation. It turns out that the relationship between him and Ellie from Dead Space 2 has since gone Splitsville, and we now find Isaac hiding from EarthGov following the events of Titan Station. Unfortunately for him, it doesn't take very long until his past catches up, and new characters Robert Norton and John Carver suddenly confront him with yet another mission involving the destruction of a marker. Ellie is seemingly in as well, so we don't waste a lot of time arguing and continue to escape the city with our new friends, all while members of the Church of Unitology attack the colony and try to hunt us down. This is also where Dead Space 3 introduces a few of its new features, human enemies with guns and also a crouching mechanic. It's fairly easy to condemn these additions, but I surprisingly enough didn't mind having enemies shoot at me. While such a change would feel incredibly strange in other survival horror games, it actually kind of makes sense here. I mean, Unitologists have always been a threat in the series, only that now they're not infected, and it just seems rather natural that they would then fire at us in such a scenario. And this actually kind of helps with the immersion, since the developers don't have to come up with some stupid reason for them not to shoot at us. The crouching I'm certainly less fond of though. It feels strange to have this as an option because it simply doesn't add anything to the way the game feels. It's only ever useful in these very few gunfights, and when fighting necromorphs there's absolutely no point to it, and with how oddly spaced the gunfights are, I actually ended up forgetting all about it until I hit the crouch button by accident. Considering all of this, it is at least nice to see that it is mapped to a button that wasn't used for anything in the previous entries, so you can largely avoid it. Several shredded necromorphs and unitologists later, we then board a train after putting it together ourselves and ultimately escape the city by jumping onto our friend's spaceship, the USM Eudora. From here we now try to get in touch with Ellie, whose last point of contact is located in the system of ice planet Tau Volantis. But if there's one thing that we learned from the previous two games, it's that nothing ever goes right in a Dead Space game. So our spacecraft of course gets caught in a minefield, and what follows is a rather jaw-dropping set piece involving the destruction of our ship and our team's heroic jet speed getaway through what boils down to kind of a giant intergalactic wood chipper. We then board the deteriorating CMS Roanoke and soon enough reunite with Ellie, only to find out that she's actually now in a relationship with Norton. Something that he freaking never cared to tell us. What an asshole. But yeah, I mean, all jokes aside, this weird little love triangle is actually one of my least favorite parts of the game. I mean, sure, telling its compelling story has never really been the series' strong suit, but at the very least, it has so far succeeded with creating a believable atmosphere. This right here, on the other hand, takes me out of the game more than any contrived crouching mechanic ever could. Ellie simply has not had enough screen time to be relatable whatsoever. We weren't introduced to her until the later half of Dead Space 2, and all of a sudden she's an integral part of Isaac's motivation for this mission. This kind of just creates a weird dissonance between the player and his alter ego. Like, while you mostly care about your survival and succeeding with the mission, Isaac will constantly ask about Ellie and where she is and how she's doing. I was just way too worried about killing monsters and picking up various resources to ever have her cross my mind. I guess maybe in that sense, Isaac and I were simply chasing two very different kinds of booty. Anyway, inscriptions discovered by Ellie reveal that there's supposedly some kind of machine located on the surface of Tau Atlantis, and finding the phrase "turn it off" repeated throughout these inscriptions then leads her to the conclusion that Tau Atlantis is the homeworld of the marker, and that said machine is what's responsible for the necromorph outbreak. That makes our next stop the aforementioned ice planet, and our mission the shutting down of this machine. Now, how do you think Isaac and his crew managed to land on the planet? A, they perform a textbook landing in the soft snow of Tau Atlantis, perfectly capturing the planet's tranquility and beauty. Or B, they have a few issues with the landing and unfortunately break an engine as they safely land on the planet's surface. Or C, they fly straight through another debris-filled death maze, slicing up not only the spacecraft, but also several crew members along the way, while scattering the survivors all across an Arctic wasteland, completely unprepared for survival under these harsh conditions. Yeah, just see for yourself. With Isaac regaining consciousness, we now find ourselves in the midst of a snowy landscape in its complementary snowstorm. This is a pretty drastic change of scenery and more than welcome after mostly exploring areas that we have come to expect from this series. This whole deviation from the formula is something that was very much lacking in the first few chapters, and also something I absolutely want to give them credit for. It's nice to be thrown into something so unfamiliar when everything up until this point has been nothing but. Seriously though, the first 7 chapters of the game take place exclusively on and in between space stations and shuttles, and that is simply not as engrossing as it once was. You have a feel for how these areas work, and that just doesn't really help with building an atmosphere. The surface of Tau Atlantis now has a completely different rule set. Enemies can pop out of the ground, you have to stay close to fires in order to keep your body temperature up, and finding your way around is certainly not as easy as it once was. The whole change of scenery was rather refreshing and actually made me keep playing after an already extensive session. Chapter 8 is easily one of the most memorable parts of the game. But of course, once again, all kinds of shit goes down. We make our way from fire to fire and soon find a trace of the rest of our team, who we manage to catch up to rather quickly. The rest of the game now evolves all around a nearby research lab. We thaw a giant frozen necromorph, continue to fight it outside of the lab, and also shoot Norton in the head right after finding out that he was planning to betray us all along. And with this renewed hope for our relationship with Ellie, we now go looking for a device referred to as the Codex. Someone called Rosetta, located on top of a nearby mountain, seemingly has what we need, and so we begin our ascent. Here another new feature is introduced, the ability to rappel up and down a variety of cliff faces. These segments I actually enjoyed for what they were, even more so when they make a return in a later chapter of the game. Whee! But something about them really bothered me, and that only really comes apparent when looking at the grand scheme of things. Dead Space 3 is very formulaic, like 90% of the experience you have already seen in its predecessors. Health works the same, stasis works the same, kinesis works the same, weapons, despite a new crafting system, largely feel the same. Even most of the enemies are carbon copies of pre-existing ones. And while all of this is also very much true for Dead Space 2, you could kind of excuse it for that one, since Dead Space 1 did keep me longing for more. But seeing this formula repeated yet again without any significant changes is just disappointing. There are new ideas sprinkled in every once in a while. Chapter 8 is a good example of that, so are the repelling sections and a really neat alien city towards the end of the game. But the core experience just remains untouched. Everything that you do, you have done in some way before. It's funnily enough comparable to all the doors that you run into throughout the game. They find new ways of dressing them up, but in the end it's still the same door that you've been opening ever since part 1. With this being said, they are still more than robust mechanics. They still work and still feel as polished as ever. Gameplay was great in Dead Space 1, gameplay is great in Dead Space 3, it's just that the novelty of it all has certainly worn off for me. Alright, back in the actual timeline of Dead Space 3, we are now in the lab that Rosetta is supposed to be in, and after uncovering that she is in fact a cut-up alien, we are tasked with reassembling her in order to get to the information inside. Once we have retrieved all her body parts, which just so happen to be scattered all across the lab, it is then revealed that we had it all wrong. Contrary to earlier assumptions, Tau Volantis is not the homeworld of the marker, instead one of an ancient civilization which, similar to the human race, also uncovered a marker. This discovery then led to a disastrous infestation, which would have culminated in convergence if the alien race hadn't constructed a giant machine freezing the planet and every life form on its surface. And in case you don't know what convergence is, it's more or less Dead Space's own little Rapture-like event, where if the marker can create enough necromorphs, that biomass then floats up to the sky to form a giant moon, which after completion then goes on to infest other planets. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. This also now means that we no longer need to turn the machine off. So we did it then? Not really. It's a Dead Space game, and remember what I said, nothing ever goes right in a Dead Space game. So, evil Unitology guys, take the codex from us and head down to the machine. We of course follow after, go do some more repelling bits, and eventually end up in the aforementioned alien city. This is yet again an area that I want to give them credit for. When entering the city, I once again saw myself at the end of what was already a pretty long session, but similar to what had happened with Chapter 8, this whole change of scenery had me interested enough to keep playing and subsequently beat the game. Dead Space 3 certainly does a great job of offering new environments, and it absolutely has the most variety out of all of the three. But what I said earlier about the whole formulaic nature of the game also very much factors in with what I otherwise think is one of the biggest positives about it. So we're in this exciting new place, right? They give us really neat new things to consider. We can now use an enhanced version of both kinesis and static. There's a new way of transportation. But the core encounters, they are still the same, and it's so easy to read. When you enter a room filled with a series of human-sized boxes, you know you're just seconds away from another weird Raptomorph fight. When you see big vent-shaped holes in the walls, you know that the enemies are going to pop out any second now. I love this section of the game. It's the most exciting Dead Space 3 has been in hours. But why not go the extra mile and change some of the rules for it? Why only sprinkle in some auxiliary changes? And this isn't the only place that is this way either. Really cool snowscape? We're going to change some of the factors, decrease visibility, surprise attacks, scarce supplies, but still, once again these damn boxes. And this actually brings me to something that a lot of you are probably interested in. How scary is Dead Space 3? Not very, to give you the quick answer. It sure does have its moments, but most of those are constructed in a fashion very similar to the previous ones. You have your randomly activating machines, corpses getting back up, all fairly creepy, but expected. What still managed to get me at times was the audio design. They once again did a great job of surrounding you with all kinds of unnerving sounds. Especially the aforementioned raptor fights have some incredibly frightening audio effects connected to them. These are so well constructed that you immediately get this feeling of demoralization and helplessness. And this is an absolutely remarkable experience. But scary? I wouldn't call it scary. Now, what I would like to ask is, does Dead Space 3 have to be scary? To me at least, a sequel doesn't have to convey the same vibe that the original had. If you for example take a look at the Alien franchise, they did a great job of shifting the focus moving from 1 to 2. While the first one is this really creepy but more traditional sci-fi horror movie with just one monster, the second one tells the story of space marines trying to survive against hordes of aliens with all kinds of militaristic equipment. The tone is very different, but each stands out on his own. So I don't think that Dead Space 3 has to be scary. I personally do not need it to be scary in order to be a worthy successor. But if Dead Space 3 was supposed to be more of this power fantasy, with Isaac Clarke finally kicking Necromorph ass after being plagued by them for years, I would argue that they still should have committed more. While all the shooting and an inventory constantly filled with medipacks certainly supports that theory, the usage of several horror game tropes does not. You will, for example, constantly find yourself split up from the team. When something needs to be retrieved from somewhere, Isaac goes on his own. When you just reunited with your team and everything seems fine, Isaac falls down a ledge. Or a ladder. Don't get me wrong, I do think that Dead Space's atmosphere is at its strongest when you're all alone. But I also would have loved to see the developers go against their own formula and add something that deliberately supports the shooting-heavy vibe that I'm getting from most of the encounters. Opportunities like the Nexus fight towards the middle of the game simply aren't made use of. You see your teammates fighting alongside you for a few seconds, then the boss shows up and you're on your own. But enough of that, let us return to the final section of the game. The Unitologists eventually manage to turn off the machine, causing convergence to continue. With the Necromorph moon reactivated, everything cracks open and our mission to stop the moon's completion begins. So we run along a series of floating rocks in what is actually a really cool and impressive set piece, just to soon face the final boss of the game, the moon itself. This old bastard is taken care of rather easily by fending off waves of enemies and firing big floating markers at its eyes whenever you get a chance. I wouldn't call this the best boss fight of the series, but it's functional and provides a rather satisfying end with you cutting the moon open and thus freeing your friend Carver just in time to reactivate the machine and reject convergence. This unfortunately means that all the previously floating pieces now crash down into Tovalantis, along with Isaac and Carver. In one last scene with Ellie, we then find out that the Markner signal can no longer be detected. Mission accomplished. Before leaving you guys with some final thoughts on the game, I want to very quickly touch on one aspect I've avoided talking about so far. Microtransactions, which are integrated into the game's crafting system. So this is easily the most criticized aspect of Dead Space 3, and I also think that the game would have been a lot better without the option of buying additional resources for cash. But I also do not think that it ruins the game either. The problem with it is that it's always there, right? It's staring at you, reminding you that whatever you're crafting right now is not as good as what you could be crafting after dropping some extra money on DLC. This actually took most of the fun out of the crafting system for me. Even to an extent where I stuck with the plasma cutter as my primary weapon for most of the game. It is not game breaking, it is just really annoying and not really helping with the immersion. I absolutely would have preferred the old system over this, but it's not like you cannot play the game without buying anything. In conclusion, I have to say that I'm very happy to have played Dead Space 3. I was previously of the mindset that it's a game not worth playing and merely a bastardization of a once phenomenal series. I still don't think that it's anything remarkable. For that, it simply just doesn't risk enough, but I'm certain that friends of the franchise will find a lot of good things here. There are some really cool moments, new environments, impressive set pieces, and it's still a highly polished game with great graphics, sound design, and gameplay. It's just how untouched the core experience remains, and the addition of microtransactions that weigh this game down. The former is without a doubt the biggest issue with Dead Space 3 though. We know how it all works by now, and the few additions like occasional gunfights and repelling bits are just not enough to make it stand out. However, if you can deal with that and forget about all the microtransactions, Dead Space 3 is arguably still worth playing. The fact that I personally didn't need another Dead Space with the same formula doesn't make it an objectively bad game. I just would have liked to see something that is a little bit more than that.